Kilpatrick was born in 1920. He was born in Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City was still a pretty rough developing city in the 1920s. It was a city that was mostly still emerging from this recent frontier past, and was a city in the 1920s. Kilpatrick grew up in a place that was very much an oil city. It was an oil boom town. And Kilpatrick vividly remembered a lot of oil derricks springing up all over the place as this was going on, including oil derricks springing up on the state capitol grounds and in people's backyards. But it was a place where people were making a lot of money and then also losing a lot of money. It was a city that was filled with very wealthy people, people who were new to wealth, and then also a number of roughnecks as well. He came from a mixed background. His father was a timberman, somebody who was involved in the lumber business, had come out to Oklahoma in search of sort of a private fortune for his own. He came from a wealthy merchant family in New Orleans that had a lot of that was very connected to the merchant and commercial class there. And that was very much, that's where Kilpatrick really drew his southern roots from. He identified with New Orleans and Louisiana, and that was a big part of his upbringing through the father. His mother was a woman named Alma Hawley, and her parents, there was a long, they came from the South, but vicariously, and it was much longer ago, from Virginia and Kentucky. And they had made their way to Oklahoma via Minnesota and then down to Kansas, and her family had participated in the Boomer generation and the actual land run and all that, and so that meant something to people in Oklahoma at that time. That was their pioneer generation. That's always important in those western states to get that straight. As Ron had mentioned that his book was on Williams at the University of Missouri. That's where Kilpatrick ended up going to college, and he went there young. He started college at the age of 16, and he was obviously somebody who he was incredibly attracted to newspapering. He loved the smell of ink. He was weird about that as a child. He actually liked that smell and loved being around it, and he worked. He worked in a newspaper office growing up, and his mother was somebody who was really the main driving force in his becoming a newspaperman and learning how to write. And but unfortunately for Kilpatrick, when he went to the University of Missouri, he went there during the 1930s, and his first year there was 1937, and it was also that year that was the height of the Dust Bowl. In the Great Plains. And what happened that year was the dad lost the lumber business. It literally was collapsed under the weight of dust and grit from all that. And to add, to make it worse, what happened was Kilpatrick's father then abandoned the family. He actually left with the company secretary, and they went to Fresno, California with so many thousands of other Oklahomans. But that was a traumatic experience in Kilpatrick's early life as the father had abandoned them at this. But he managed to go through the University of Missouri's that prestigious journalism program there, where he graduated early in 1941. There's the funny story about him when he graduated from journalism school was that he graduates, and he's Kilpatrick as a young man was just a really slim figure, and he wrote letters to 4 newspapers back in the East. He really wanted to go to the East Coast and make a name for himself. And the Richmond News Leader, which was the afternoon, that was the main paper in Richmond, it was the afternoon paper, they wrote him back and they said, yeah, we've got something basically as a cub reporter. And Kilpatrick, before, I mean, this was just like an advertisement. They just said, yeah, that's right, we're looking for somebody. Well, he gets on a train and he goes all the way from Columbia, Missouri, all the way to Richmond. He shows up, presents himself at the office the next business morning after the weekend of traveling, and he says, here I am for the job. And the managing editor there said, okay, well, okay, I'll give the kid a shot here. And so they signed him on at the News Leader, just starting out writing and rewriting a lot of copy from earlier in the day. Well, those were the war years, and so it was easy to get a promotion quickly, and Kilpatrick quickly rose up in the paper as other columnists were called to wartime service. And he was not, Kilpatrick's 2 main influences at the paper were Douglas Southall Freeman, who was, Freeman was really known, he was a really prominent figure around Richmond, but then also a lot of Americans knew him as somebody who was one of the premier biographers of the Confederacy and the Confederacy's leadership during the Civil War. And Freeman was a character. He would, Kilpatrick got a lot of his, he had a good work ethic anyway, but he had things to learn from even Freeman. But the famous story around the office was that Freeman on the way to work would actually stop along Monument Avenue. And I don't know if how many of you have been through Richmond and all, but there's this, this parade of native sons who are important in Virginia's past. And Freeman would stop at the Robert E. Lee statue of Lee on top of Traveler, and he would pay homage to Lee. And this was, the morning ritual. That's the kind of newspaper that Kilpatrick was at. And then the other major influence there was a man named John Dana Wise, who was a South Carolinian, and also became Kilpatrick's mentor there, really the principal person who's in charge of shaping a lot of Kilpatrick's ideology as a young man. So they both had a lot of importance for him. Freeman ultimately, just a couple years later, he's going to retire from the paper. Kilpatrick becomes editor in 1953, becoming one of the youngest editors of a major newspaper at that time. And so more specifically for the article here, the thing that he becomes, famous locally for and then infamous for in terms of the civil rights era is in November and December of 1955, he writes these interposition editorials. So he's the editor of the paper now. And he writes these interposition editorials are a response to the Brown decision. Kilpatrick emerges as an opponent of the decision itself. And he's drawing back, interposition has this long history in the South, going back to Calhoun, and then Jefferson and Madison with their Kentucky and Virginia resolves. And it's the idea simply that you can interpose the authority of the state between the federal government and in the local level. So you use it as a buffer against what you see as unlawful, unconstitutional things that are emanating from the federal government here. And so it's an old 19th century idea, and Kilpatrick makes it live again here, calling the Brown decision unconstitutional, saying this is a ruling that was based on a moral decision, which the justices were included in the opinion itself. Said that you can't do that. You can't base the law based on morality. Said that this ruling was based on psychological studies done on the injuries, the impact on black students in segregated schools, and Kilpatrick was not convinced of that. And then also Kilpatrick, somebody who said that, look, the Brown decision has no precedent. He would look back at 19th century cases on segregation. He said, look, the court routinely has defended segregated education in this country, and there's no precedent for this here. It should be Congress that should be passing some kind of law, and here you have the court passing a law instead. So based on that, what happens in Virginia and in one way or another many other southern states is you have a series of what are called these massive resistance laws in the mid and late 1950s. As in Virginia, way that this plays out, the best example is again, so you're granting the state the right here to intervene, interpose itself, prevent desegregation of schools. In Virginia, the consequences of this are pretty extreme, where they end up closing down 3 school districts during the late 1950s, and this is part of what Kilpatrick and his compatriots wanted. 1957, he writes a book called The Sovereign States. That was his first book, and that was really his anti-Brown treatise. And there, what is important about those interposition editorials and then the Sovereign States also is that Kilpatrick was somebody who was, he kept presenting this issue of desegregation and the stand against desegregation as a constitutional issue. This was a states' rights issue. This was not something that was based on race. Kilpatrick he had mixed results in actually following through on his own, saying that this isn't about race, because sometimes he would often fluctuate and actually say this is about race. But the idea here was try and distance, try and buffer things here, and so don't make this out to seem like we're about racial inferiority in this. And he would refer to this as the transcendent issue, but it was a constitutional issue based on this interposition idea. And Kilpatrick had a prolific career fighting civil rights. That was the initiation of this. He wasn't known as a civil rights opponent before writing those editorials, but he made a career here in the mid-late 50s, the early 60s, of writing a series of articles, editorials against the movement, debating Martin Luther King in 1960 about the sit-ins on NBC, going to Mississippi in 1962 when the university had its desegregation crisis with James Meredith, and there Kilpatrick shows up. writes these really incredible editorials that actually appear on the front page of the News Leader, which is not typically where they appeared. And actually he went into Meredith's home and interviewed the family, which was something that segregationists did not typically do. And so and he covers the riot. There's great writing I mean, Kilpatrick was always a powerful writer, but he's got these great scenes that he depicts in those editorials on the riot itself and then the cleanup of that. Also in 1962, and this is in the aftermath of that riot, he publishes another book on race, and it was called The Southern Case for School Segregation. Now and I'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk here, but that's forming part of this itinerary of segregation that he's got. Helps to set up something called the Virginia Commission on Constitutional Government in the late 1950s, and this was sort of a sovereignty commission. It was a watchdog commission. These are the kinds of things that all southern states were setting up in the late 1950s to combat civil rights at the local level. 1964, he participates in this lobby, this major lobby against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was had several endorsements from leading conservative and then also segregationist groups, advocating the creation of a private school academy system in the South in the late 60s and into the 1970s, and using that as a way to check desegregation as well. And then in 1964, a little bit of a different vein here, he starts writing this column, A Conservative View, and that was his, I mean, a lot of people knew him because of that column, and that was, A Conservative View was, this is a column that eventually, it's a nationally syndicated column, and then it gets picked up by, it's first at a Newsday picks him up for this, and then Harry Elmlark at the Washington Star Syndicate, which was the conservative counter, it was the rival of the liberal Washington Post, then picked up Kilpatrick's column, and it becomes a national hit with Elmlark's help. He starts making this nationally well received. And that was a column that continued all the way until 1993, so it's got a long, long lifespan. Then in 93, when that one went away, Kilpatrick started a column called Covering the Courts, which was specifically about Supreme Court rulings, decisions. That ended in 2008 because of health reasons. And then the year after that, in 2009, he discontinued his other popular column that many people know of, and it was The Writer's Art. That was his grammarian column that he did for a number of years. That was discontinued in January of 2009. Now, you can also, if you don't have to do this, you're free to show your age if you remember Kilpatrick in the 1970s when he appeared on CBS. When he appeared, okay, Ron's got guts. Okay, this was something new at that time, to have these talking heads come on and have these political debates on TV, where CBS has this show, and then at the end of 60 Minutes, Kilpatrick would appear with a liberal antagonist. And they actually weren't in the theater at the same time. They were recording this in separate studios. But at first it was Nick von Hoffman, and von Hoffman gets asked to leave in 1974 when he says a couple unpleasant things about Richard Nixon. Whoa. And then Shanna Alexander is brought in, and that was supposed to be sort of the battle of the sexes there, as picking up with as feminism was. They wanted to bring out that tension on TV. And then you can show your age again here if you remember the Saturday Night Live skit where this is all, of course, there's no, all right. This is the only thing that would be worth showing you if I actually had a TV on here, so Saturday Night Live picks this up, and on their Weekend Update edition in the late 70s, they would have Dan Aykroyd would play Kilpatrick, and then Jane Curtin would play Shanna Alexander, and they were much more brutal with each other than Alexander and Kilpatrick. Alexander and Kilpatrick actually had a lot of affinity for each other, and were friends off camera. But Saturday Night Live went to town with this, and of course, when Dan Aykroyd would really get going, he would say, "Jane, you ignorant slut," and that was and then Jane Curtin would go, "Dan, you pompous ass," and there was nearly bloodshed over this. Okay, so just a little bit of so there's a lot of parts to the story here. Now, why did I write the article? Well, essentially, what I did for the article was I took a chapter from my forthcoming book on Kilpatrick, and was trying to trace Kilpatrick's incarnations. I was trying to think about how this guy got to be where he was in life. I was thinking about questions that started in graduate school as a history grad student, and we had I read an article on Kilpatrick that really had to do with massive resistance And so I asked, well, what happened to this guy after massive resistance, if that's what he was known for here in terms of civil rights history? And then also what that turned into was really, what happens to a segregationist after segregation? That was something that I was interested in. What are our traditional narratives about the civil rights movement? Because we have this idea that these guys are bad guys and then they go away and then, okay, you don't have to deal with somebody like that again. But Kilpatrick breaks if that's the mold, then that's not necessarily true, right? This is not a story about decline for Kilpatrick, and instead it's about finding creative responses to desegregation, and that was what Kilpatrick really became a master of doing. So how did this guy beat this segregationist rap? Or, as my former chair of my department said, and he was, Bob had a certain way of talking, but when I was at my dissertation prospectus defense, Bob turned to me and he said, "How'd that son of a bitch make it on TV anyway?" And I said, well, okay, I don't know, but all right, so, okay. We'll edit that out for the camera there. Now, what I want to do is basically I'm going to use 3 quotes from Kilpatrick that appear in the article and make some comments about what he was doing in those different transition points during his career, and I'll try and do this in chronological order. And the first one is there is a line from the Southern Case for School Segregation. And so here's this book that comes out in October 1962, and Kilpatrick is writing, and he is aware that, at least in terms of legalized segregation, that this doesn't have long to go here. He's been seeing sort of victory after victory for civil rights. And this is one of the incredible things that one of the things that stood out to me anyway when I was reading the book about, and so this is the quote. He wrote, "Jim Crow is dead, but the legal shot that felled him also put massa in the cold, cold ground. The paternalism of generations is vanishing year by year, to be replaced by a healthy skepticism. The Negro says he's the white man's equal," and then he put this part in italics. Show me. Show me. Right? What's this guy up to with this? So here he is, 1962. Show me you're the equal of a white man. Okay. By 1962, Kilpatrick knows that massive resistance, that is over. He knows that you can't keep doing this. This hasn't won out in Virginia. And he also knows that there's really nothing that is glorious or noble about the second lost cause, which is sort of another way of referring to this massive resistance era, right? There's really nothing noble about the first one either, but so many white Southerners had convinced themselves that the cause wasn't about slavery, right? That it wasn't about tearing the nation apart, that it wasn't about this seditious convulsion of bloodshed. Well, the second lost cause it's a scandal. And these guys know that there's really not going to be a great way of talking about this. There's not a way that you can talk about the second lost cause as something redemptive, which left a lot of segregationists alone in the wild. These guys are not sure what to do anymore, because at least the preceding generation had ways of talking about this that made them look like they're kind of good. Well, Kilpatrick doesn't see that writing on the wall here. So what he does instead in the early 60s is he's going to start looking for ways to swap older arguments for segregation guaranteed by race for some kind of alternative. And that's what he's looking for here in the early and mid 60s. And what he's doing at the end of that quote is he's saying, let's talk about the merit and the character of blacks, of African Americans, right? Now, surely Kilpatrick was not the first person to ever question this goes back, right? There are other people who would question the merit and the character of blacks. But what Kilpatrick is doing at the end of this quote is he is daring African Americans to succeed or to fail. That's what he's explicitly about here. He's putting the burden of Southern history onto blacks, right? It's on your shoulders now to prove that you're the equal of a white man, because these Jim Crow laws are failing. They're falling apart. And he's looking around and he's saying, so that's not going to be the reason here, right? So in other words, black uplift is black America's problem. That's what Kilpatrick is saying here in this book. And in 1963, the year after that book came out, Kilpatrick was paying attention. He's playing with some language here that, if you listen to Martin Luther King in his dream speech in August of '63, there's the line about King not wanting his children to be judged by anything other than the content of their character. Well, so here's Kilpatrick, and he's saying, all right, you want me to judge your kids by their merit and character, I'll do it. All right, I'll do it. So he's trying to reposition himself here to fit into a post-Brown, to a post-civil rights era. And you can see him beginning to develop that before a lot of other segregationists were willing to start doing things like that, okay? Society clearly wasn't going to condone arguments that were based on race, wasn't going to accept arguments that were based on hereditary science, something that Kilpatrick himself had struggled with. And so instead what he's suggesting here, and he'll develop more and more, is what about racial discrimination disguised in the language of the free market? What about equality of opportunity? What about merit-based advancement? That sounds much better. That sounds like that's something that you can work with here. All right. So now what you can see, even by the early 60s, is Kilpatrick is somebody who's already poising himself to deal with this affirmative action debate, school busing debates, different kind of race issues that are going to emerge by the late 60s and the 1970s, right? Were blacks advancing because of their merit, or were they advancing because of their race? Oh, okay. Right? Is this forced equality, or is it equality of opportunity? That's an ongoing theme in American life, and it's also a common critique by conservatives, but it's a growing concern in a nation grappling with affirmative action. And luckily for him, it's a point of view that you can sell in a newspaper column as well, right? If you're writing about hereditary science or these arguments for racial inferiority, you can't do that, but you can talk about merit. You can talk about character, right? Equality. So during the mid-1960s, Kilpatrick's nationally syndicated column, it really takes off after 1965. After 1965, it's already in over 60 newspapers. By 1966, it's in over 100 newspapers. By 1980, Kilpatrick, he has this conservative view column in over 538 papers. So it really does well here as he works for the Washington Star. And many readers, or at least more and more readers, were regarding him as a very polished professional columnist, not some old relic of the massive resistance era. And that was conscious on Kilpatrick's part. He knew that he had that legacy to overcome. In other words, Kilpatrick was learning to temper his tone on race. And writing a national column had become an avenue for him to escape this racist past that he had. And luckily, developing that tone was good for business as well. All right, so now for the second quote. And this is an exchange that Kilpatrick had in 1966. So the column is taking off here. And this is an exchange that he had with a man named John Hunt. And Hunt was the senior editor at the Saturday Evening Post in 1966. And what Hunt wanted Kilpatrick to do, was he wanted Kilpatrick to re-release this article called "The Hell He Is Equal." And "The Hell He Is Equal" was an essay that Kilpatrick had written for the Post in 1963, but the timing was all wrong. He writes this article arguing not just, okay, again, it's this idea of, if you say that you're my equal, then blacks have to prove that they're equals. But it's worse than that, because what he does in the article is he says that actually he's very clear saying that blacks are not going to be the equals here, and in fact, that advancement for blacks is only going to injure Western civilization and white society. Right? By 1966, this is an article that Kilpatrick wants to go away. He wants this thing to go away 3 years later, and he didn't release it in 1963 because it was supposed to come out, and it was going to be in the days just after the bombing in Birmingham of the 16th Street Baptist Church. So the Post pulled it at the time. Now they say, well, let's try it again, maybe. And instead, we're going to name this thing "Negroes Are Not Equal," right? Take some of the sting of "the hell he is equal" out of this thing, and try again here. So here's Kilpatrick's reply. From my own professional point of view, and I wish I could do a good Kilpatrick voice. He's got this great gravelly Tidewater voice from Virginia that he adopts. From my own professional point of view, the problem is quite simply that I do not want and could not possibly afford to be publicly associated with these views, phrased with such vigor. Since the piece was written, as you may know, I have launched into the writing of a nationally syndicated column. It's going tolerably well, but my whole pitch is a reasoned and good-humored conservatism, in which I shun these racial views almost completely. My syndicate tells me that the biggest single obstacle to further sale of the column is my reputation as an old-fashioned Southern racist and segregationist. If the column is to make headway and to provide me a platform for selling dozens of ideas, more important to me than the anthropological differences, if any, of the Negro race, I must continue to treat the subject, if at all, with the greatest restraint, compassion, tact, and all that. So by 1966, Kilpatrick, he's got a reputation to lose. He's got a national reputation to lose. He's got a syndicated column to lose, and the stakes are much higher now 3 years later than what they were for him before. And business, after all, was business, and segregation was bad for business by 1966, which reminds me of this great, there's a Groucho Marx line in here, right? I've got principles, and if you don't like those, I've got others, right? So Kilpatrick's got some Groucho Marx syndrome going on here, and it's the part of that quote that I focused on when I came across that exchange between him and Hunt in the archives was the part where he writes anthropological differences, if any, of the Negro race part, right? Because Kilpatrick's not so sure that he's abandoned this black inferiority stuff. He is sure that that's not good for his career in journalism, and so he says, let's drop the issue. And so Hunt says, we'll drop this thing, and Kilpatrick buries that essay in his personal papers. It's not to be revived. All right, but what was Kilpatrick learning? Were his racial views really changing? Right. When Kilpatrick was an up-and-coming newspaperman and becoming editor in Richmond, he wrote for a very provincial press, and that was obvious to all. There was a real spirit of conformity in Richmond at that time. It was not a city that encouraged free thought. Thinking leads to doing bad things in a conformist society. It leads to asking questions about race relations, asking questions about segregation. And there was an urge to control what people believed in Richmond. And the news leader's role was huge in being a public opinion maker in that city, in that region. And Kilpatrick was very aware of using that position to be sort of his bully pulpit. He was going to use that to spread his views and also spreading this massive resistance idea. The powers that be in Richmond wanted all-out opposition to desegregation. Kilpatrick thought that's what he was supposed to do. And so you please those who are above you, and then you'll do well. So Kilpatrick knew that. He was somebody who was would always talk about hating bureaucrats his entire life, but he knew what it took to be a bureaucrat there. Okay, so, but now the difference is he's writing for this Washington Star Syndicate. He is writing for this Washington community. DC was not Richmond. And he's seeing, in other words, when he goes to DC and he's writing for this Washington Star Syndicate, Kilpatrick was seeing what race was not like by being nationally syndicated, by being there, okay? He's keeping different company in Washington. And by the late 1960s, this guy he's enjoying this, right? He's having drinks with this Washington press corps. He's meeting the elite in Washington, getting to know an ever-increasing group of politicians and journalists. Power, status, prestige, better pay, those are all nice things to have, and Kilpatrick understands all that, right? Kilpatrick does not want to be associated with the lunatic fringe anymore by the late 60s, right? He'd come a pretty far place from Oklahoma, and he likes it that way, right? He had always wanted to be professionally successful. There's no big secret about what he was doing at all. I called Roger Mudd on the phone one time, and Mudd had worked at the news in Richmond at the newspaper with him. And when I called Roger Mudd at home, he was really clear. He said, look, this was obvious. Everybody knew that he wanted to make friends and to do well in a more cosmopolitan city, and there was something about money here, right? So Kilpatrick refused that request from Hunt. Okay. A third quote, last one for him. Noting the changes, Kilpatrick made these comments in a 1973 interview. So people are noticing this about him, that there's something different about the column. He's not the segregationist that he used to be. And what he starts doing here in this 1973 interview is he'd been doing this since the 1960s, but he's talking about not seeing race anymore. He's talking about being colorblind in his view of the law and justice. And this is a clever little metaphor that he had picked up from reading William Alexander Percy's Lanterns on the Levee, and you talk about seeing through new glasses, and I don't see race anymore, right? This wasn't anymore. It wasn't about supporting state-sanctioned segregation. That wasn't something that Kilpatrick believed in. This was about racial fairness across the board. Okay, so this is the comment that he makes in the '73 interview. Oh, let me do this first. Sorry. Kilpatrick says, in these areas of race relations, I sometimes think I'm getting to be like the Catholic convert who became more Catholic than the Pope. Uh-oh. I spent years as a Southern editor filled with old-fashioned Southern racial prejudices, fighting to preserve segregation in our schools. Then came the light. So he's got his Damascus Road moment here. Today, I'm just as incensed as my Yankee critics were incensed 30 years ago. at what seems to me the virulent evils of a pervasive racism throughout our society. That men and women must be hired, promoted, educated, transported, assigned or not assigned solely based on the color of their skin strikes me as indefensible. All right. Now, anybody who was paying attention to Kilpatrick over the last couple years before this, they had been hearing him say things like this. And my interest in this quote was in the last part of the quote. What's this pervasive racism that Kilpatrick had latched onto? What is this that's still lingering around here, right? Because a lot of, if you're on the liberal side, if you're on the left here, you're going to say, well, the racism is that Southerners haven't changed their ways, and there's still institutional racism in the country that's keeping people discriminated against, right? But what Kilpatrick does here is he says it's not the old Southern bigots, right? But instead he says it's egalitarians. It's liberals, it's activist judges, it's liberal bureaucrats, it's people in the Department of Education, it's these different judges in these federal courts around the country who are making these school busing decisions and affirmative action policies and insisting on quotas, and that's the problem, right? In other words, it's those who want to use government policies to uplift minorities. And he didn't restrict it just to African Americans, it was also directed at women as well. But definitely supporters of affirmative action and supporters of school busing programs, okay? What Kilpatrick starts saying here and developing more maturely is if a policy, if a ruling or a law favored blacks, and specifically based on a racial policy here, it's bad. It's reverse racism. Now, I don't know, there's some people who actually think that Kilpatrick was the person who actually coined the, he didn't coin the term reverse racism, but we think that he's probably the first conservative to use it in that, strain there, okay? Any such racially based policies were racist policies. That's what Kilpatrick starts saying, right? And that included the old segregation laws. So you're just a racist in reverse if you're a liberal committed to such things. Now, as a conservative like him, what's nice about this is you can invert that language of the civil rights movement, right? You can talk about, a one-time segregationist like him can get born again, as Kilpatrick himself suggested, right? You're defending meritocracy. That's what you're really doing here by opposing these things. You're defending meritocracy, you are about equality of opportunity, and you're about color blindness. And it doesn't sound like there's much to get bent out of shape there about if, it doesn't sound like the old segregationist language, right? So this guy, though, what Kilpatrick's realizing by the early 70s is he doesn't have to attack civil rights leaders directly. He doesn't have to demean them, nor does he have to go after blacks as a race. He doesn't have to do that, and he had been sometimes capable of doing that in the past. But someone with these racist credentials could succeed in a post-civil rights America. That's what he was learning, right? All you had to do was to blame the right people. You had to blame the reverse racists, right? They were the ones who saw race, not Kilpatrick, all right? So that colorblindness idea, right? And that, so there's a bad rendition of a Gershwin song that can come out of this, right? You say racism, I say reverse racism, except there's no way of calling the whole thing off here, all right? There are bad things that are going on, okay? Now, finally, to the second part of the talk, and again, this isn't something that I deal with in the article, and this isn't part of the book, and nothing like that. But what are some lessons that are relevant to us? And I think that there's many. But what are some things that at least contemporary society and in the larger culture can learn from somebody like Kilpatrick? Well, first, Kilpatrick was behind this effort to keep the status quo intact as long as possible. That was very much a part of his game plan. He was not somebody, when you read his columns in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s into the 1990s, this was not a person who celebrated diversity. And it's not that you have to do that, but there is not an openness to a new society here in Kilpatrick's writings, right? There's not an openness to new ideas on race. There's a reluctance to embrace change. Instead, what's far more likely when you read his columns in the late 60s and 1970s is that this is somebody who's out more to demonize the opposition. He's convinced that he's right. And Kilpatrick, when it came to writing and appearing on TV, the guy could be dogmatic with people, and that was part of his style. was part of he had convinced himself of his beliefs, but it was also a product of coming from this segregated society, right? That was normal. That was something that was expected in Richmond. And when you come from a conformist society, it's easy to shun change. That was something that Kilpatrick had learned, right? There's a tendency to shield yourself from the outside and to enforce conformity, right? That was something that the news leader did well. So change was something that was fearful to segregationists, right? It was the fear of the unknown, of what would come after this segregated society that upset people. And but what if there are still racial problems after American society has been opened up? What happened, in other words, when Jim Crow is really dead, when those segregation laws are gone, now who's responsible if there's a pervasive racism out there? Who's at fault here, right? So who's to blame for racism and inequality after the death of Jim Crow? Well, Kilpatrick quite clearly said that it was liberals. They were the culprits for racism. They're in the way of colorblindness. And blacks were now responsible for their own fate, right? They're free to rise or to fall in this competitive open marketplace. And today, this issue is still with us, right? This is still an issue that is that's still heated. This University of Texas case that's out right now, this affirmative action case, for instance. And now I've not followed that case, completely, but the things that I know about it for sure is that there are people on the bench right now who are opponents or at least skeptics of affirmative action. That's the majority view, and which several justices have made clear very recently in remarks about college admissions. And they're of the opinion that race should not be a determining factor when allowing people into universities, right? And there's a new book out right now that deals with this on issues of diversity and affirmative action. It's called Mismatch by two conservative writers named Richard Sander and Stuart Taylor. And so this is, and were he alive, Kilpatrick would have liked that book, and he would like the Supreme Court's majority view on these things. I don't think he liked my book exactly, but he would have liked parts of it. But he definitely would have liked this Mismatch book. So the first thing to learn for us is pay attention to the uses and the abuses of race. We're still a bit too interested in demonizing each other over race. And racism is this powerful, almost too powerful word that we've got here. It's if there's one unforgivable sin, and I'm going to use a little bit of religious language at the end of this, which Kilpatrick would not have been comfortable with because he was an agnostic. But there is one unforgivable sin that comes out of the civil rights era, and that is you are not to be a racist. To be called a racist is the worst label that we have. And conservatives argue that liberals and diversity files were the real racists and vice versa. Well, when I'm looking at these things for us today, what I wonder about is not only where did these debates come from and how did it emerge, and certainly Kilpatrick had a strong role in shaping some public opinion about all this, but what other kind of questions are we ignoring when we rush in to just focus on race in these admissions practices in higher education? How are we today admitting students to college? And that seems to me to be a very legitimate debate to have. And when we only look at race in an instance like that Texas case, did we miss other things in doing that? Now in Texas, I know, for example, there's special things about Texas, right, where they're taking the top 10% of these high school classes, and then they added in something on top of that where they're saying, well, after that's done with, now we're going to make these racial, there are going to be diversity considerations here to make after that. But are they focusing, in Texas has this system of saying you get the right grades and you can go to, not just UT, but the school of your choice in the state. So are we encouraging that grades game a little bit more, even going into college, right? Is learning only about grades? Is it only about getting the right grades to make it? What about merit-based entrance for schools or leadership scholarships? There's a variety of there's a lot of code language out there, code words about even beyond race that are out there in terms of college admissions, and most of it has a lot of it has nothing to do with learning or the ability to think for oneself. So I think in some sense when I look at this, and Kilpatrick was, up till the end of his life, there were affirmative action cases and then school busing cases or redistricting cases that were going on in Seattle and Louisville and Hawaii that he wrote about in 2007. And so I know that Kilpatrick would have favored what the court seems to be leaning towards right now, but also I think we're a little bit limited sometimes in terms of what kind of questions we're willing to ask about these admissions procedures. I don't know. A second point, and this is a larger concern from that. Kilpatrick tried to avoid his past with race. He was always trying to protect himself in his career. And in a way, and I'm speaking about this racial aspect of his past, and it's pitiful. There is a tendency in Kilpatrick, there's a lack of a real analysis to deal with his past in segregation and this inheritance of racism. He was always a little bit too reactive when it came to these things. Somebody who he was always sort of doing a little, too little to actually solve problems, more eager to lay blame on people. And sure, he had distanced himself from the lunatic fringe and from segregation, but Kilpatrick didn't quite learn the right lessons to learn about race. There's some wrong things I think that someone like him learned in all this. And one of those, in other words, there's certain things that you just don't do if you're somebody like Kilpatrick. One of the things that you don't do is you don't downplay your responsibility for things. You don't say that interposition was about states' rights or that interposition helped to keep people from getting violent. That was something that Kilpatrick would often say. And you don't say that. And, was it peaceful in Little Rock, for example? Well, people had interposition going through their mouths at that time, and it got violent there. You don't blame blacks, not in the 1960s and 1970s, for inequality. There has not been enough time to go by to let people actually enjoy this open society that's gone by here. But he's very quickly saying, you show me, you prove that you're equal. And you also don't put all the burden of blame here on these liberals or these judges or whomever you selected here to blame for this pervasive racism, right? There's sort of a tone that goes into this that says, anybody but us, anybody but us. And that's not the right lesson to learn. Kilpatrick needed to ask more about why he had to change. Why did he have to change his tune? Why was he forced to accept desegregation in some ways? Also, what came before that conversion from being, he's becoming more Catholic than the Pope here, what came before that, right? What he's not saying enough about is that the door to blacks to African Americans had been closed for a really long time. And that's not as much a part of those writings as what it could have been, right? What about the 100 years of segregation before integration and affirmative action came? What came before, right? Well, you can only claim redemption when you acknowledge sin, right? Again, not a word that Kilpatrick was prone to using. But in other words, you can only really make progress when you admit error. And so you have to pay attention to causes and results, and you have to do that, right? Kilpatrick was, again, he was a little bit too eager to demonize others, not as interested in doing this, right? At pointing at that evil or whatever you want to call it, right? In fact, when I interviewed Kilpatrick towards the end of his life, that was I had to work to get this interview with him. Had to write multiple people until they could vouch for me, and I went up to Georgetown to visit him. And in the letter that he wrote me, I was in Charlottesville at the time, and he wrote and he said, you can come up here to Georgetown, we'll go out to eat, we'll have a couple Bloody Marys, but the things that you can't ask me about race, you can't ask me about the Brown decision, and you can't ask me about civil rights. And I went, damn, I'm writing a civil rights history here. So he was taking things off the plate before, so I had to do some things there to talk about that. But you can see evil elsewhere, and that's easy enough. It's easy for us to objectify other people when we're looking for wrongdoing. Now that's a dose of Christianity that's laid on here to this racial experience, but we're dealing with the universal experience that's in here as well. So my second point is about this. The second point in the larger concern with Kilpatrick is about forgetting. All right, and the lesson from Kilpatrick is don't forget. So let me don't forget what you did. Don't be too eager to do that. And let me finish with a quote from William Faulkner. As an employee of the University of Mississippi, I'm contractually obligated to mention William Faulkner wherever I go. And this is from Faulkner's novel, The Hamlet. And there's a great line in here from one of the Snopes clan. This is a novel that's full of Snopes and this horde of people who are running around. And it's about the burden of the South's past. It's about the burden of slavery, of Reconstruction and race in the South. But it's really a quote also about all of us. It's about all of humanity. And this is a quote from Flem Snopes. And every time I quote Flem Snopes, I have an urge to clear my throat and kind of, I won't do that to you. But this is what Flem Snopes says in the book. Only thank God men have learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to cure. Right? Only thank God men have learned how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to cure. What a line that is, right? Forget, don't cure, right? Try to forget what happened, structure ways to forget, make your past go away if you can, wish it away, don't talk about certain things. But forgetting is also, there's a counterintuitive part to that, and forgetting is a way of remembering also. It's a story that you want to have told to people, okay? And Kilpatrick was into forgetting too much by the 1970s, right? So as we approach the integration of, Ole Miss just had its integration celebration, 50 years of that just recently, had mixed results about how that went. But as we approach the University of South Carolina, the correct USC, and the integration here, let's make sure that we don't forget either. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yep. I'll go down the row here. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Marjorie Sproul from the History
Oh, yeah.
Department.
Yeah.
And I read your article when it first came out.
Yeah.
And I liked it very much, so I was not surprised to see that you got picked for this. I'm working on a book called Women's Rights, Family Values, and the Polarization of American Politics, and I'm focusing on the 70s. And I find your guy plays a major role in my story as well.
Okay.
What I'm finding here is that you ask what happened to these people after it became unacceptable to be openly racist.
Yeah.
What I'm finding is that right at the moment in American politics where it becomes politically unacceptable to be overtly racist, it becomes politically profitable for conservatives to be anti-feminist.
Yeah.
And he is poster child for that. And I'm particularly interested in the way that he comes after Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem, and just is cheering when he says literally, finally, he said the Gloria Steinems and the Bella Abzug have had their way for 10 years. Now the Phyllis Schlaflys are coming out of the kitchens.
Right.
He praised it as this great victory.
Yeah.
And I could go on about
Yeah.
what he said, but I was just wondering, what did you find when you interviewed him, when you talked to him about the way he kind of channeled some of this belief in innate differences and hierarchies? Did you see him channeling that into gender?
Gender it's always there. He writes a lot on ERA, and he's bringing it up to bash it as much as the Democrats are bringing it up to fail. And so a lot of the columns are the ones that are explicitly about feminism usually have to do with that. And then the larger critique of just affirmative action itself. And this is supposed to be a marketplace. And so any kind of, he sort of had the same stance on, if it's a race-based policy, that's, all right, if it's women also, then you can't do that as well. And so these Virginians are so weird, aren't they? Because they're pulling all these magic tricks here with this stuff. And of course, they're going back to that 1964 Civil Rights Act, when both these things were that becomes the seedbed for the quotas and for what becomes affirmative action, and not making, not discriminating based on sex and race. And of course, it was Virginians who Howard Smith and the others were the ones who ruined themselves on that, because they were the ones who threw in the stuff about sex at that time. They thought, here you had these Virginia segregationists, and they think they're going to pull this cool move where they go, hey, let's make this about sex too, and those Yankees won't think that this is so hot. And then they get both things pushed through, and they go, damn, right? So but it's usually in the ERA. And then when he writes in Nation's Business, there's a number of things there. There's a defense of traditional society that runs a lot in those in the Nation's business articles, and then also when he writes those Scrabble pieces, and he gets back to this idea of an organic community that's been untouched by the 60s writ large. That's where you see there's a defense of family in there, of traditional, of patriarchy in the South. There's a long history of that. And then even when you look at that Saturday Night Live skit, what's so interesting about that is, I mean, here's SNL, this is not, and this is not a conservative organ at all, but they're willing to use words like Jane, you ignorant slut. It's okay to be a misogynist, but the racial, it's not a racial insult. She doesn't say, Dan, you racist ass. She says, you pompous ass, and it's clearly meant as a, so even Saturday Night Live is interested in forgetting about the racial stuff and helping to do other things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And actually, I was getting to that point. My
Yeah.
question is, I'm struck by the absence of African Americans or blacks in his life and in the narrative.
Yeah.
And yet, there is the focus is on blacks.
Right.
So, this notion of white privilege, which he certainly has.
Yeah.
And that's a part of his whole narrative. Where does that intersect with the absence of African Americans? And they don't seem to appear at all. So I'm wondering, where does that segregationist rhetoric come from, and the privilege of changing that rhetoric that was basically the same? It was just repackaged to sort of fit with the conservative model. So because he's in Washington D.C. at sort of at the end, this very large African American population,
Yeah.
and they're sophisticated in many ways, and they had been for more than 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So where does that absence of African Americans come from, in this notion of white privilege? Because that's really what it is, and it sounds as if almost there's a fear for him, and that he's really competing with other whites, and yet it is this discussion about blackness and civil rights movement. So just sort of, if you can kind of play with that and tell me, what does this mean for him? I mean, because you say you talk to him and he doesn't want to talk about civil rights, he doesn't want to talk about all the things that gave him that privilege and made him so popular, and so and gave him wealth and fame.
So how does he? So what are those relationships like with? Yeah, he's got before the Interposition Editorials, Kilpatrick was I don't know how many people know about this, but he had this. He was actually, for a brief time, he was known as a civil rights advocate in Richmond because he defended a local African American named Silas Rogers. And there was a case there where Rogers was accused wrongfully of murder. And Kilpatrick got onto this case and said, this guy didn't do this. He looked at all these facts. He said, this doesn't look right. He's appealing to the governor of the state, to John Battle at that time. And in fact, the local African American newspaper hailed him as being this great, this was a great thing that this local white did here, and this guy is on board for racial justice and fairness. And so sometimes Kilpatrick, he was able to actually point back at some points and say, I actually, this colorblind rhetoric, this colorblind idea that I've got here, look at my past, 1943, and then as editor, and the case emerged out of 43, and then he becomes editor and fights for this thing. So he could point to personal things like that and say, I did things. He could point to friendships with like Carl Rowan, and he would appear with Carl Rowan on TV in the 70s, and he could say, look, I'm friends with this person, and I'm sure they did have a cordial relationship. I've never read anything from Rowan's perspective that said that that was that he didn't believe that there was sort of some sincere, at least professional relationship there between the two of them. He would. He was somebody who tried to work to, in that relationship with Martin Luther King, those two had debated each other at least twice. And when King died, Kilpatrick wrote this really powerful, obituary for King. But the tone of the obituary wasn't quite right. It was more like, boy, I wish that King was still around because he was peaceful. And these others, these Black Power guys, I'm not so sure about what they're up to. And then he helps Jesse Helms in the 80s to try and fight the decision to have a national holiday for Martin Luther King also. There's, Yeah, other times he would point to family relationships. He pointed to a granddaughter in a 2000. There's an article that he wrote in the early 2000s about how a granddaughter had married a Moroccan Muslim, and this was a sign of diversity in his own background. And his granddaughter had gone to school with African American kids. I don't know if I'm doing a job. I'm trying to restore.
Getting there. I mean,
Yeah.
There's this context here.
Yeah.
And in my own work, what I'm finding
Yeah.
it is this notion, in my area, it's way before this,
Okay.
is that African Americans are talking about the absence of the discussion about blackness, and yet you have white people, in effect, arguing their inferiority and in essence, making money off of this discussion about them.
Okay.
And yet they know very little about them.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why I asked, it is it's a complicated sort of discussion.
Mhm.
The African Americans that, particularly this woman that I'm writing about, is very clear about it,
Uh-huh.
because she actually grew up within a white community.
Okay.
And so when she becomes raced, when she becomes black or designated
Oh.
as black, when she leaves the North and comes south, she begins to really sort of formulate ideas about whiteness.
Mm.
So that's why I asked the question, because
Yeah.
it seems to me that he has very clear ideas about blackness, but
Mhm.
he doesn't seem to have as clear of a vision of what white privilege is.
I see.
And that he's engaged in this.
Yeah.
And that he's in effect profiting off of this discussion about blackness. So I was just
Yeah.
wondering where those black people were.
Yeah.
That seem to have created all this animosity and these issues
Right.
for him.
It's treated more like a group than.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm not doing a great job of answering your question, but it's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, the one.
I have one question, and in some ways this might be another way to get out what Wanda's asking.
Yeah.
It's a question I asked of Dan Carter, who is on our faculty here, and it's about writing a biography of someone whose views you personally, find in some ways abhorrent.
Mm.
And so what I'm wondering is if you could just talk for a minute, and there's lots of students here, lots of undergrads, about how you go about writing a biography of someone who has these racial views that are certainly very different than what we would expect from someone today. How do you go about, I mean, this is what I sort of asked Dan Carter here, how do you go about writing a biography of a quote bad guy? And you have a lot of personal opinions in this talk, and so I'm wondering, how do you straddle that line?
Yeah.
Because these people are certainly worth writing about, but it's very different than traditional sort of hagiographic biographies that we often see.
Right. I guess, the first thing I'd say, it's not a great way to get a job if you write about a segregationist. That's the one thing I would say to students of the civil rights era. Because, now look, there's not going to be a lot of Southern history to write about if you can't write about a segregationist, but that's one thing I would say to people who are considering doing that. I would say that when I was working at UVA in the archive, the archivists would come up to me, two of them came up to me in the course of the year, and they would bring me the boxes and they would go, "Now, you don't actually like him, do you?" And I would say, what do you have in mind? And because there's a lot of things that you can get upset at Kilpatrick about. It's not just the race things, but they were. I think it was for me. There was don't go in there like my department chair said at the time. Don't go in there trying to gunning for the guy. Was something that had to be resisted in all this. Take him for let's look at what he actually writes here. And then take him seriously. And that's an influence from my dissertation advisor who wrote an article a number of years ago, about 12 years ago now, about really thinking about opposition to the civil rights movement, contrarian perspectives, people who didn't agree with it. That there's been too much writing about the activists. And that perspective has been not completely covered at all, but the emphasis has been much more on that. So when I went into it, it was more thinking of it like having an interest in writing about somebody that this is from a contrarian history kind of perspective, and that helps to deal with anything that comes up in there that might be personally unpleasant that you don't like. I don't know. What there was a question in the
One more
back.
question?
Yeah.
Bobby, did you want to
I just wanted to comment. You mentioned Carl Rowan.
Yeah.
And the friendship, I guess, they had later.
Yeah.
This issue about his whiteness and the privilege of that, Rowan took him to task often in the 60s on those very issues, as did others like Ralph Bunche, Norfolk Bill and Guy. So I think if you take a look at the black press in that period, they're not sort of giving a pass on these discussions at all.
He, now Kilpatrick, a lot of times, again, think of that moment when he was in college and his dad abandoned the family, and the family business went bankrupt, and he had to work his way through college. And so personally, Kilpatrick a lot of times would say, I am sort of that rugged individualist. Don't tell me about privilege. I had to get through the Dust Bowl, and did you? And then I helped out my family, and he was protective about that part of his past, but the legacy of being afforded certain opportunities because of being white was not there as much. Instead, it was a celebration of what white civilization had given everybody else, and you could almost hear you can hear that old paternalistic defense of the positive good thesis coming out of slavery from that in a 20th century version. I don't know.
I want to thank Will for being with us today.
Thanks.
And,
Okay.